Hello friends, Matt D'Antuono here with Donec Requiescat. First I want to recommend that you check out my new book, A Fool's Errand, which is a brief, informal introduction to philosophy for young Catholics. It'll be informative for anybody, even in regard to this idea of the philosophical idea of God, and in relation to some of the things that Dawkins discusses in his book. Today we're going to look at the beginning of Chapter 3. I'm going to deal with the rest of Chapter 3 later, but I wanted to take a whole video to look at Dawkins' analysis of Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways. Basically, he fundamentally misunderstands the arguments. He seems to really miss, first of all, the arguments themselves, what the main point of each one is, and he misunderstands the God that we're talking about here. He has this really anthropomorphic, concrete kind of idea of God that he can't seem to get rid of and move past, which Thomas Aquinas and any of the great theologians have done. In this regard also, I highly recommend Matt Fradd and Robert Delfino's book, Does God Exist?, where they go through the 5 ways and they actually respond to Dawkins' arguments here. And it's a great book. It's simple enough for most people to read. It's a great introduction to the thought of Thomas Aquinas and the metaphysics and the kind of idea of God that he's really presenting. I want to present a quote here from Frederick Copleston, who is a philosopher, a historian of philosophy. He actually wrote a whole series of history of philosophy textbooks. And talking about Aquinas, he says that if we misunderstand Thomas Aquinas' terminology, then we're fundamentally going to misunderstand his arguments, and we're going to misunderstand the whole worldview that he's trying to present and the idea and understanding of God. And that's one of the places where I think Dawkins, where his book has failed, is in understanding some of this technical terminology. And again, I can't help but quote again from Lawrence Principe, who talks about this idea that there is high-level theology. It's not the everyday theology that gets put into cartoons that the average person on the street is talking about. It's high-level theology that's just as complicated as any other high-level endeavor. Dawkins says that he hesitates to, but then he does say that the arguments are vacuous. He should have stuck with his hesitation, because the fact is, you will never find anybody who is more rigorously logical than Thomas Aquinas, and then in the scholastic tradition following him, and even the tradition leading up to him. Nobody was more rigorously logical when it came to thinking about God and thinking about theology and understanding him than these Christian theologians, and even beginning with some of the church fathers. Very, very precise in their terminology and their definitions, even as we talked about in the last video as well. And then if we misunderstand it, then it just looks like wordplay, and we have this tendency to throw it out the window. He then claims that the first 3 arguments are really the same, and he just lumps them all together and claims that they are just claiming a regress, and they have to put God in there to prevent the regress, and that's it. But the 3 arguments are different, and God is not thrown in to prevent the regress. Instead, they are logical arguments where this idea of God and this different thing in each of the different arguments is necessitated by the logic. So let's take a look at them. He starts off by saying, in trying to summarize the first argument, that nothing moves without a prior mover. Or we can also say, at the beginning of every chain of movement, there is a first mover. Right? So it's not just that each individual thing, but even looking at the chain, somewhere at the beginning of the chain, there's a first mover. Then he says, this leads us to a regress from which the only escape is God. The fact is, Aquinas doesn't invoke God at this point. He does a little bit more work by showing that in the first movers, there is also motion. And so any chain of movement that we look at and we see a first mover, well, that first mover as well is also changing, and therefore being moved by something else. And then we go all the way back, and so what we're realizing is that even every chain of movers that we see, even that first mover, is also being moved. And important, movement and change are essentially the same thing. Movement is movement from one characteristic to another. Movement from potentiality to actuality in some way, right? Like a table is black and then I paint it white. That is movement, right? Because it's a change in the potentiality and the actuality of the color of the table. What the argument boils down to is that for every chain of changes, for every chain of moving, changing things, there has to be a first changer or a first mover. And so the whole universe is this chain of movement. And he's not necessarily saying that at the beginning of time there was a mover, but that underlying everything that is moving, there has to be some first unmoved mover. If there is no first unmoved mover, then you don't get the entire chain of changing things. But there is a chain of changing things, and so therefore there has to be a first mover that is unmoved himself and is moving everything else. And so the God that we get comes right out of the logic, right? If there's no first mover, then we don't get the universe. But there is the universe, therefore there is this first mover. So Thomas Aquinas doesn't say, oh look, here's a regress, we have to stop the regress, and so we're going to throw God in there. We get this idea of an unchanging changer, an unmoved mover, that comes out of the logic of the argument. Dawkins then posits something had to make the first move, and that's something we call God. It's important to note that even in the context of Aquinas, in the Summa Theologiae or in the Summa Contra Gentiles, in either case, this is the first argument, and he's not necessarily saying yet, oh, this is the God of Christianity. He's arguing from what we observe to this thing. So even at the end of this first argument, all we have is an unmoved mover, this unchanging source of change in the universe. That's it. He's not claiming anything else at this point. And so Dawkins and some others are being misled in thinking that Aquinas is positing then the God of Christianity. He's getting there, and he will get there, but there's a lot more logical work to be done. Let's talk about the distinction between the first and the second argument. The first argument is about things that are changing. The second argument is about things coming into existence and then having their existence sustained. They don't cause themselves. They don't cause their own being. That's what he's talking about here. Dawkins summarizes it this way by saying that nothing is caused by itself. Every effect has a prior cause, and again we are pushed back into a regress. That's a straw man of the argument. It's not that simple. Aquinas does more work here. First of all, he's not saying by itself, like as if there's something that's like alone being caused. Instead, what Aquinas is saying is that nothing causes itself. So that second statement is closer, that every effect needs a cause. And important to note, again, the prior doesn't necessarily mean in time. It could also just mean in metaphysical necessity, right? That this thing is before the other thing because that other thing is based on and depends on this other thing for existence. Or in some other way, like for example, I could say that the matter of my body is one of the causes of me, right? So the matter of my body is prior to myself in a way. And then again, he says this has to be terminated by a first cause, which we call God. Again, Aquinas is not just running away from a regress. He's looking at the similar logic to the first argument. Not the same thing, but the logic is similar, the form of the logic. Basically, if there is no cause, then there is no effect. And even in a whole chain of effects, things that have been brought about, then there has to be some first cause. But if that first cause is also an effect, then that needs a cause as well. But even a whole chain of causes, even a whole chain of effects still needs a cause. And the whole universe is just this harmony and puzzle that's been put together, interlocking causes and effects. So if there is no first cause, then we don't get the effects. But we see that there is a world of effects, so there must be some first cause. That's it. But that first cause can't have any other cause, otherwise it too would be an effect. For the third argument, Dawkins starts by saying there must have been a time when no physical things existed. Thomas Aquinas never says that there had to have been a time when nothing existed. As a matter of fact, I think he would call into question the whole logic of that. If there's nothing, then there is no time. And so you can't have a time with nothing because time necessitates something that is existing. And Aquinas even thought that it wasn't possible to prove from a philosophical standpoint that there was a beginning in time. As far as philosophy is concerned, we don't know if the universe has always existed or if it had a beginning in time. The beginning in time, Aquinas takes as information from revelation, not as a philosophical thing that he can prove. And again, this whole idea of time is really important, and stepping out of time to think atemporally is really difficult. It requires a lot of abstract ability to think that way. And I've seen very little evidence in this writing of Dawkins that comes close to understanding that or doing justice to it. Secondly, Aquinas is not just concerned with physical things, he's concerned with anything that exists. Here is the passage from the Summa Theologiae where Thomas Aquinas is talking about this argument. And you can see there is not a place here where he says there was a time when nothing existed. He doesn't say that anywhere here. What this argument has to do with is this idea of necessary and contingent existence. That if something is changing, if it comes into existence in one time and goes out of existence at another, then it's not necessary for that thing to exist. If it had to exist, if it was a necessarily existing thing, then it wouldn't change and it would always exist. And so everything we see in the universe, even the universe itself, is changing or coming into or out of existence at different times. Therefore, if everything is merely contingent, then there is no necessary thing to bring about all the other contingent things. They're all dependent, so they need some ground on which to stand, right, to give an analogy. And that thing is God. Again, a very thin notion of God, but this one is actually really important. That God is the very essence of existingness itself, right? He is the act of existing. His very essence is his existence. You know, like for me, my essence as a human being is not the same thing as my existence. The two are not the same thing, but in God, it's one thing. And so even though we're still just dealing philosophically here, the notion of God as an unmoved mover or an unchanging changer, source of change, as the uncaused causer of all things, and as the very essence of existingness itself, right, necessary being, this is actually now a very rigorous and logically satisfying idea of God that we can work with. Right? And this is what Aquinas' whole system is then based on. And a lot of Catholic theology does justice to this. And Catholic theology lines up perfectly with this idea. Dawkins says that Aquinas slips in there the unwarranted assumption that God is immune to regress. But again, this idea of God that we end up with from the arguments is, by the very logic of this thing, by the nature of this thing itself, immune to regress. Right? It's not like, oh, we're just going to pick out this thing and say it's immune to regress. Aquinas is talking about something here that Dawkins doesn't even do justice to, and that something that, by the very nature of what it is immune to regress. Again, Dawkins is relying on this very anthropomorphic, concrete idea of God, and he says that this God, why the God of Christianity, essentially with all these personal characteristics, etc. But again, he's relying on this very thin notion of God, and is not the God that Aquinas is talking about. It's not the God of Catholic theology. I presented a bunch of quotes from theologians throughout history in another in the chapter 2 video, and in another video I've made about the God of the five arguments and the God of the Bible, and this God, this more high level understanding, richer idea of God, is the actual God of Catholic theology. And so again, what Dawkins is doing is he's setting up this straw man and he's knocking it down. He then puts forward an interesting argument that the God omniscience and omnipotence are mutually incompatible in God. And you can see how that would be. If God knows what he's going to do, then he doesn't have the power to change it, which is interesting and really a clever argument. However, the God that we're talking about is not in time. He is an atemporal being, not something that sees and knows about what's going to happen in the future and then reacts to and responds and changes things. That's like some kind of a puppeteer. That is not the God of Catholic theology, and it is not the God that Aquinas is talking about that he's trying to deal with in these five arguments. And so again, he misses the boat. In God, he is atemporal, and there is no passivity, as if he knows things and then reacts to it at a different time. God is the very act of existingness. Everything that exists in all of time comes from God in what for him you could call a single moment. But again, realizing that that's just an analogy, an analogical way of speaking about God. Also, this idea of God learning and knowing things. Right? It's not as if things exist and then God knows them. It's God's knowledge that is the cause of things. Right? His omniscience is not just received information. His omniscience is causative. His knowing has causal power because he is the very act of existingness itself, and then by knowing it and willing it, that is the cause of the existence of everything else. He says that it's more parsimonious to conjure up, say, a Big Bang singularity or some other physical concept as yet unknown. Stephen Barr, a theoretical particle physicist who wrote the book Modern Physics and Ancient Faith, which I recommend, says this: it seems that to abolish one unobservable God, it takes an infinite number of unobservable substitutes. I'll leave it at that. Also, the singularity or some other physical cause would themselves be changing, and those things would not be immune to regress. So Dawkins is doing what he accuses Thomas Aquinas of. He's conjuring up something and saying, well, this thing, whatever it is, would be immune to the same kind of regress. But if it's physical or if it's a singularity, then it is temporal, it is spatial, it is changing, it's not necessary, it's contingent, and then that thing also needs a cause, it needs a changer, and is subject to the regress. The fourth argument is about this idea of perfection, levels of perfection. And Dawkins tries to summarize it by saying there must be some other maximum to set the standard for perfection. And he misses the point. It's not just about judgment, as if like we have the meter stick, and the meter stick is what we use for measuring everything else. What Thomas Aquinas is talking about is that when it comes to the transcendentals, things like being, truth, goodness, beauty, unity, they have to have a source, right? All the other perfections come down to those. And at the top of that category, the top thing is the perfection, and that's the cause of everything else. So we're talking about causation here, how those things have come into the universe in the first place. Not talking about a mental standard for comparison. And his example about the smelliness actually kind of works, right? What is smelliness? Well, smelliness results from having certain intellectual powers, of being able to receive information and process it and then call something smelly. Things are smelly because they have existence, right? But they have a physical and very limited form of existence. And so if we follow that chain of existence, if we follow that chain of intelligence, then we find that there has to be some source of those things, right? Some ultimate standard of perfection. And that standard is the cause of all other existence, even in these very limited, imperfect forms of existence. Then he looks at the argument from design, and in some ways I kind of agree with his argument, because what he's looking at is not the argument that Aquinas gives. He's looking at what some people have put forward, to do justice to Dawkins here, but this is not what Aquinas puts forward, to look at the complexity of things in the world, right? Purpose in like animals and plants and that sort of thing. That's not what Aquinas is talking about, right? Aquinas gives the example of an arrow, and Dawkins gives the example of a heat-seeking missile, which, as far as Aquinas is concerned, would actually be a better example. Dawkins himself gives a better example here, and Frad and Delfino in their book discuss this, because a heat-seeking missile has its purpose built into it. It's got this program built into the heat-seeking missile, and so its purposiveness is not something that's come from outside and imposed on it. It's something that's actually been built into the very nature of the thing. And that's what Aquinas is talking about. Something like, say for example an electron. An electron is by its nature drawn to, like the purpose is to go towards or be attracted to a positive charge. Right? Something that has a positive charge on it. This is something that's built in. It's not like a hand comes and then moves it by design that way, as if it's an external force, right? Like a puppeteer or something like that. But it's the very nature of the thing, part of its own characteristics, that has this built-in design to it. Why does it have a negative charge? Why is it the way it is? Why is it that thing? Well, that purposiveness has come from an original purposer, some that has put that purpose and design into the very nature of the electron itself. So we're talking about the very basic fundamentals of the nature of reality itself, right? Not some externally imposed force that designs things like an engineer in a workshop, but more like the things themselves by their natures and what they are, having their own purpose. Frad and Delfino in their book give the example of a bunch of robots who build a house, right? The design is not so much in the robots as they build the house and imposing order on the house. It's more like the robots themselves who have the blueprints uploaded into the robots. It's they're programmed to behave a certain way and to do certain things. And that's what we see when we look at nature and get down to even the very fundamentals of the nature of subatomic particles and that sort of thing. And so, to do, again, justice to Dawkins, he's had a lot of these types of arguments thrown at him, and he's trying to respond to them, and unfortunately he misunderstands them. He throws those arguments that have been put to him with the arguments of Aquinas, and he misunderstands them. But there's so many good places where he could have learned about Thomism, about these 5 arguments from Thomas Aquinas, and he just hasn't done the homework, right? Or he has and he just hasn't understood it, right? He wasn't a very good student. He could have learned. Here are some names, for example: Peter Kraft, Ralph and Dennis McInerney, Joseph Pieper, Frederick Copleston, Jacques Maritain, Etienne Gilson, Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange. The list goes on. And he could have learned from any of them, but unfortunately he didn't. Now make sure you don't make the same mistake and criticize this straw man idea of God or this straw man idea of the arguments, because that would be intellectually dishonest. So thanks for watching. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please subscribe and share with your friends.